Hi all, welcome to the A-Level Law Essay channel. In today's episode, the essay is going to be covering the chapter legislation and how it relates to Parliament's sovereignty. Before we begin, please subscribe to my channel for more video guides on essay writing and many other interesting topics. With that said, let's get started with part 1 of video guide number 7. Today's question reads, Parliament is sovereign over all under its power. In light of the statement, discuss the nature and characteristics of the British Parliament's sovereignty. From the question, we can infer that it covers the chapter legislation, and the focus of the question asks us to discuss the nature and characteristics of Parliament's sovereignty whilst considering the statement. Introduction. As the question focuses on the chapter legislation, we should first start by mentioning what laws are, together with a brief definition of Parliament. After that, a brief definition of the words sovereign and sovereignty should be made whilst making a quick link to Parliament. It is important for us to only give a brief definition of key words in the introduction, as details and further explanation should only be given once we get into the content of the essay. Next, the thesis statement, which helps to set the direction of the essay, should be emphasized. Here, we should first critically discuss the nature and characteristics of Parliament along with its importance as the highest law-making body before considering its sovereignty over all under its power, with explanation of its working and the reason for its sovereignty. Point 1. As a bridging point between the introduction and the core of the essay, it will be good to have some brief background discussion on Parliament and its basic nature or characteristics. Here, we should emphasize that the concept of a Parliament is the product of modern democracy, which considers society's self-governance paramount in the abeyance of tyranny and chaos. As the highest law-making body of the land, it consists of publicly elected representatives who sit in the House of Commons and the law lords who sit in the House of Lords. It should be mentioned that as a constitutional matter, the House of Commons has more power in the lawmaking process compared to the House of Lords, as the Commons are democratically elected individuals who represent the masses. The Parliament Act 1911 and 1949 should be pointed out so that the importance of democratic lawmaking can be explained. It should also be noted that the discussion of the actual process of lawmaking in Parliament is not necessary in this essay, save for a quick mention if need be. This is because it isn't the focus of the question, and so more attention should be given to discussing Parliament's sovereignty, its importance, and how it works. Point 2. In discussing the British Parliament's sovereignty, we should emphasize the definition of sovereignty again, with critical thoughts about what it actually means. A mention of A.V. Dicey and his view on parliamentary sovereignty should be made before we go on to discuss the nature of Parliament's sovereignty and its application. Parliamentary laws are sovereign over other forms of law in England and Wales, meaning that an Act of Parliament can completely overrule any custom, judicial precedent, delegated legislation, or any previous Acts of Parliament. Theoretically, there is no limit to what Parliament can make as law, since any Act of Parliament is seen as the will of the people. A peculiar nature of Parliament that should be highlighted is the fact that no Parliament can bind future Parliaments, nor current parliaments be bound by previous parliaments. However, as much as Parliament is sovereign or supreme over all under its rule, there are a lot of things that Parliament cannot realistically do, especially regarding constitutional matters. But we'll get into that in the next point, where we will endeavour to test Parliament's sovereignty. Another particular nature of lawmaking in Parliament that should be highlighted is the fact that no one can challenge an Act of Parliament once it has gone through the proper process of passing the Act. This is even so when there appears to be a mistake in the Act of Parliament, or even that there was some element of fraud in the process of lawmaking. Despite these issues, it will still be considered law and will remain supreme and legally binding unless and until Parliament actually repeals or amends the Act at a later time. Point 3. After discussing the nature of Parliament and its sovereignty, we can now evaluate the statement in the question. That is, Parliament is sovereign over all under its power. Here, we will be considering if Parliament is actually sovereign and whether or not there are any limitations to its sovereignty. One might say that, in theory, Parliament's will is the will of the people, and so therefore an Act of Parliament is but an extension of the will of the people. So, the first question here is whether or not the power of Parliament is limited by the people it had been mandated to rule over. Or, a better question should be, can Parliament actually go against the will of the people by making unpopular laws or downright draconian and oppressive laws? Next is Parliament's relation to the European Union through the European Communities Act 1972. Due to the United Kingdom's membership of the European Union, some limitations have been self-imposed upon Parliament's sovereignty. This is where many laws which are passed by the UK Parliament will have to be in line with European laws, regulations or directives, and the most significant is the Human Rights Act 1998, which states that all acts of Parliament must be compatible with the European Convention of Human Rights. All these issues and questions must be discussed in detail with critical views, opinions and comments so that we can address the statement in the question and score higher marks for our effort. Please do check out part 2 of this video guide where I will address these issues and questions properly and in detail in academic essay form. Conclusion. As usual, a simple conclusion will suffice, with no extra points being mentioned in the conclusion. To sum it all up, we can highlight 1 or 2 points from the content which we think most important in the addressing of the question. Review. Before we end, let's have a quick review on the content guide. In the introduction, we briefly defined Parliament and sovereignty before we moved on to the thesis statement stating our objective for the whole essay. In point 1, we developed our essay by bridging a gap between the introduction and the focus of the content by briefly explaining the nature and characteristics of the British Parliament. In point 2, we endeavoured to explain the meaning of sovereignty and how it applies to Parliament. In point 3, we considered how Parliament may or may not actually be absolutely supreme and that its sovereignty has its limits due to a lot of practical factors. We concluded it by summing up our discussion and highlighting some of the more important points in the whole content of the answer. That is the end of the content guide for this video tutorial. If you have any questions or opinions on my approach to answering the question, please do comment below. Do check out part 2 of this video tutorial where I will go through with you a sample essay on this question. I will put a link to it in the description below. If you find this video tutorial useful, please like, share and subscribe to my channel for more.